Look, I'll be honest with you. Street Fighter 6 is one of the best fighting games ever made. I'm not here to talk down on it, but Invincible Versus arrives on April 30th, and after everything I've seen so far, there are things it's doing in a way that SF6 simply doesn't. And that's not a bad thing. In fact, it's great. The more good fighting games there are, the more reasons we have to play. So today, we're going to talk about 10 specific areas where Invincible Versus might have the upper hand. Let's get into it. For me, this is one of the areas where Invincible Versus has the biggest chance to stand out over Street Fighter 6, because the brutality there doesn't just feel like a random visual effect, but part of the identity of the Invincible universe. Official material describes the game with real-time blood, visible injuries, torn clothes, and violence designed to reflect the brutal impact of the confrontations, while Street Fighter 6 follows a much more stylized and controlled path, with a teen rating and only mild blood in specific moments. What I find most interesting is that Invincible Versus doesn't seem to want to stop the fight to show gore. The developers themselves said the idea is to have the violence happen as a natural progression of combat, with characters becoming covered in blood and even changing their posture when they are near defeat. This, to me, fits the series much better, because Invincible has always sold the feeling that every hit has real physical consequences, while SF6 transforms impact into a visual spectacle with paint, glows, and stylized exaggeration. And that's where a personal point of mine comes in. When a game based on a violent work softens that side too much, I feel it loses personality. Invincible Versus is already being presented as a brutal game with a mature rating for blood and gore, so it seems to understand that this violence isn't an accessory, but an essential part of the power fantasy and the cruelty of that world. Street Fighter 6 remains excellent at what it aims for, but it works with a cleaner, more competitive, and more universal violence, partly due to its own premise and milder age rating. On the other hand, Invincible Versus catches my attention precisely because it accepts being uncomfortable, heavy, and faithful to the source material. And when that is well executed, the fight stops being just pretty and starts to feel truly dangerous. Stage destruction is one of those things that, when done well, completely transforms the feel of a fight. And Invincible Versus seems to be taking this very seriously. The idea that the surrounding environment reacts to the blows, that walls crumble, the ground cracks, and the space is destroyed throughout the combat, is not just aesthetic, it's a way to communicate the real weight of every attack. Street Fighter 6 has stages full of detail and incredible background animations, but the stages themselves are essentially fixed decorations, immune to what happens in front of them. What seems most valuable in this Invincible Versus proposal is that the destruction happens permanently and cumulatively during the fight. This means the stage at the beginning of the match is not the same stage at the end, and this creates a visual narrative within the combat without needing any cutscenes. You look at the environment and can already read the level of chaos that happened there, which fits perfectly with the Invincible universe, where confrontations between superhumans usually leave entire cities unrecognizable. For me, this detail carries huge weight because it's one of the things the animated series always got spot on. The impact of an Invincible fight never feels contained or isolated. It always overflows into the surrounding space. And when a game can translate that mechanically, you start to feel that absurd scale the story has always sold. Street Fighter 6 does a spectacular job of immersion with its living and culturally rich stages, but it never intended to be about destruction, and that's fine. That's not its fantasy. The philosophical difference between the two games is very clear on this point. SF6 celebrates the space as a stage for martial arts, while Invincible Versus uses the space as another victim of the confrontation. And when you're playing with characters who can punch through concrete, it makes much more sense for the world around them to scream along with the fight. If this is well executed in the final product, it could be one of the game's biggest differentiators in the genre. what makes many people quit a fighting game before they even learn how to play properly? It's that invisible wall you hit right at the start when you try to pull off a combo and simply can't nail the timing. Street Fighter 6 is incredible. There's no denying that. But it demands a level of input precision that can be brutal for newcomers. The combos have very specific timing windows, and missing a single link can break the entire sequence you were carefully building. Invincible Versus comes in with a different proposal, and it actually works. The game's combo system was built on a more fluid logic, almost as if the game is letting you play rather than testing you. You start with an auto combo activated by pressing the same button multiple times, chain it into specials, and suddenly realize you're performing a massive sequence without having memorized a single notation. This isn't an accident, it's a conscious design choice so that new players feel powerful from the very first minutes. And look, there are people in the community debating whether this makes the game too easy, but I think that's the wrong question. The real question is, what is the entry point for more people to have fun with fighting games? When you can press a few buttons and see your character deliver a stylish beatdown on the opponent, you stay in the game. You want to learn more. This trigger of immediate satisfaction is exactly what Invincible Versus hands to newcomers on a silver platter. The most interesting part is that this accessibility doesn't eliminate depth. The combo bar system, where the meter fills during sequences and you can spend it with active tags to extend combos, still leaves plenty of room for advanced players to theorize creative builds and routes. But while the veteran is thinking about optimization, the beginner is simply having fun, and both are playing the same game. This is something Street Fighter 6, despite all its greatness, still struggles with in the same way. The 3 versus 3 tag team system is, for me, perhaps the biggest game changer Invincible Versus can offer over Street Fighter 6, because it completely changes how you think during a fight. In SF6, you choose a character, learn them inside out, and master that single expression of combat, which has its own charm and depth. But in Invincible Versus, you need to think about 3 characters at the same time, managing health, entry order, and who you call for assistance in each situation. This adds a strategic layer that SF6 simply doesn't have by design. What really excites me about this format is that every character swap can become a decisive moment in the fight, much like it did in the best moments of Marvel vs. Capcom 2 and 3. That tension of bringing a weakened character to the front, risking an assist at the wrong moment, or putting together a team combination that creates unblockable situations is a type of controlled chaos that creates stories within the match that you tell other people later. Street Fighter 6 delivers precise and technical matches, but you rarely leave a fight with a crazy story to tell. There's also the identity aspect the system brings to the Invincible universe. The series has always been about a group of characters with wildly different powers interacting and fighting together, and putting 3 of them on a team and letting you mix completely opposite styles makes a lot of sense within that world. Seeing Adam Eve, Omni-Man, and Invincible on the same team, each with their specific mechanics working in synergy, is exactly the kind of fantasy the source material suggests, but has never been truly explored before. And looking at the competitive scene, this format historically creates a much greater diversity of strategies than traditional one-on-one. SF6 has a massive and great roster, but at the end of the day, you pick one and go all the way. In Invincible Versus, the meta will be built on trios, compositions, and who works well with whom, and that keeps the community exploring and creating for much longer. For a new game trying to establish itself in a genre dominated by giants, this strategic depth could be its strongest argument. The counter tag mechanic, which allows you to interrupt an opponent's combos by calling in a teammate, is one of the smartest features Invincible Versus can offer because it solves one of the most frustrating problems in fighting games, being stuck in a long combo with absolutely nothing to do but watch. In SF6, drive reversal exists as a defensive option, but it's resource-intensive, has specific usage windows, and can still be punished if read by the opponent. The idea of using a character swap as an escape mechanism completely changes the dynamics of pressure and defense within a fight. What I find particularly interesting about this approach is that it creates a much richer bilateral mental game. When you're setting up a combo in SF6, you know the opponent has very limited options to get out of it. In Invincible Versus, you can never completely lower your guard because the opponent could call an assist and interrupt everything midway. This forces the offensive player to think not only about how to extend the combo, but also how to protect that combo from an interruption, adding a layer of reading that SF6 simply doesn't have at this level. There's a very direct comparison here with Marvel vs. Capcom, where snapbacks and assists created the same type of bi-directional tension, and the best moments of that game happened precisely when both players were simultaneously trying to set up their offensives and dismantle their opponents. When Invincible Versus hits that balance, the fight stops being a sequence of alternating turns and becomes a strategic chaos where both sides have agency the entire time. For me, this is the type of design that makes a fighting game feel alive and unpredictable, even after hundreds of hours. The risk every game with this system faces is balancing. If counter tag is too easy to execute, long combos become unviable and the game loses offensive depth. If it's too difficult or expensive, it ends up being ignored like SF6's drive reversal, which many players abandoned for being too situational. But if Invincible Versus finds the sweet spot in this balance, this mechanic could be the defining element that makes it a genuinely different experience in the genre, rather than just another licensed fighting game. The verticality that Invincible Versus brings with its air dashing and aerial combo system is one of the most visually impactful differences compared to Street Fighter VI, and it makes total sense within the series universe. Invincible, Omni-Man, and a large part of the roster are characters who fly, who cross the sky at absurd speeds, and who fight battles both in the air and on the ground. Making this a pillar of the combat system isn't just a design choice, it's almost a requirement for fidelity to the source material. SF6, by its more grounded and terrestrial nature, simply doesn't have this dimension, and its absence has never been a problem because it was never part of the premise. What excites me about the aerial system in Invincible Versus is that well-implemented air dashing completely transforms the flow of a fight, because you can never predict where the next attack will come from. In games like Guilty War or Dragon Ball FighterZ, this type of movement creates offensive pressure that is much harder to read than any horizontal mix-up, because the opponent needs to cover many more angles simultaneously. When you add extensive aerial combos on top of that, the offensive player has a palette of creative expression that SF6 never offered, and likely never will by aesthetic choice. There's something very specific, I personally feel, when a well-executed aerial combo happens in a fighting game. A sense of fluidity and lightness that ground combos rarely deliver in the same way. It feels like gravity became optional, like you're building a sequence in space without the limitations of the floor, and when combined with the visual brutality Invincible Versus promises, the result should be visually spectacular in a way that SF6, for all its style and polish, simply cannot replicate. Invincible's violence in the air was always one of the most memorable points of the animation, and seeing that translated into playable mechanics is something interests me greatly. The complexity this adds to learning the game is also significant. In SF6, you can spend hundreds of hours mastering spacing, footsies, and timing on the ground, because that's the central battlefield. In Invincible Versus, you need to master two completely different axes, understand when it's worth taking the fight to the air, how to maintain aerial pressure without becoming vulnerable, and how to convert aerial situations into consistent damage. This steeper learning curve might scare off some players, but for those who want depth and variety of expression within combat, this vertical movement system could be exactly what was missing in a superhero-based fighting game. Simplified commands in a fighting game are always a divisive topic, but when I think about the context of Invincible versus, the decision to offer a mode with a dedicated special button makes much more sense than it might seem at first glance. Street Fighter VI already tried to address this with modern controls, which simplifies commands and received a very mixed reception from the community. But the game's core structure was still built around quarter circles and classic inputs. Invincible versus seems to place accessibility as a pillar from the start, rather than as an alternative mode added later to please casual players. What I find most honest about this approach is that complex commands were never about real combat skill. They were always more of a technical entry barrier that separated those who practiced inputs heavily from those still learning. When you remove that barrier, the fight itself becomes more exposed, and what really counts is your sense of timing, reading the opponent, and decision-making. For a new game trying to build a player base from scratch, this is fundamental, as it allows for real competitive conversations much earlier without spending weeks just training how to execute moves in training mode. Thinking about the audience Invincible versus wants to attract, it makes even more sense. The animated series has a massive fan base that might have never touched a fighting game before, and playing as Invincible or Omni-Man is already the fantasy these people want to live. Putting a quarter circle as a gatekeeper to that fantasy is a choice that has lost many players to many games over the years, and it seems the developers understood this. SF6 with modern controls has already proven that simplifying inputs doesn't destroy game depth, it just redistributes where that depth lies. The point that seems most important to me is that simplicity of execution doesn't have to mean a lack of strategic depth. And Invincible versus has systems complex enough, like tag teams, recoverable health management, and counter tags, to ensure the game is rich even without requiring you to memorize sequences of quarter circles, charges, or 360 commands. When depth comes from decisions and not muscle execution, the game becomes more accessible without becoming shallower. And that seems to be the smartest bet Invincible versus can make to establish itself as a relevant fighting game in an already highly competitive genre. The use of superpowers and flight as the basis of the combat system is perhaps the point where Invincible versus has the most obvious, yet hardest to execute advantage. Street Fighter VI is a game about human martial arts elevated to the extreme, and that is a legitimate and very well realized artistic choice. But the characters in Invincible exist on a completely different scale. Omni-Man destroys cities with his bare fists, Invincible crosses the atmosphere in seconds, and translating that to a playable moveset is a design challenge that, when solved correctly, delivers a visual spectacle that no Hadouken or Shoryuken can replicate simply by nature. What seems most fascinating to me about this proposal is that the spectacle style doesn't have to sacrifice combat legibility to work. Games like Dragon Ball FighterZ have already proven you can have absurd explosions, teleports, and attacks that cover the whole screen without losing the clarity of the combat exchanges. Invincible versus seems to want to go down that same path, but with a more brutal visual identity and less of an anime feel, creating its own distinct aesthetic. Super strength here isn't just a higher damage number, it's a visual language that communicates impact in a way ground movements simply can't. There's something very specific, I feel, when watching the fights in the animated series that I rarely find in fighting games. That feeling that the characters are genuinely trying to kill each other with everything they have. Every punch seems to weigh tons. Every aerial dash seems to break the sound barrier. And when two characters collide at high speed, the surrounding environment suffers with them. When a game can translate that feeling to the controller in the player's hands, you stop pressing buttons and start feeling like you're inside that confrontation. SF6 delivers precision and elegance, but Invincible versus seems to want to deliver pure, raw power, and those are two completely different fantasies. The big bet for Invincible versus, deep down, is convincing the player that superpowers and flight aren't just cosmetic additions on top of a standard fighting system, but that they fundamentally change how combat flows and how every decision is made. If a flying character has access to pressures and angles that a ground character could never defend the same way, the game starts to create very interesting strategic asymmetries. And it's exactly this kind of design where the character's fantasy translates into real mechanics and not just pretty animation that can make Invincible Versus something truly special in a genre where many licensed games stopped right at that line between appearance and substance. A story mode with an original narrative written by the animated series writers is something that completely changes the value of a licensed game, because it transforms the product from an adaptation into a real extension of the universe. Most licensed fighting games treat narrative as an obligation, a series of generic cutscenes connecting fights with no real consequence for the work's canon. Invincible Versus seems to want to break from this by bringing in people who actually know that world, those characters, and those relationships to build something that makes sense within the established mythology. And that, to me, is a much bigger promise than it seems on the surface. SF6's World Tour is fun, creative, and technically well executed as a mode for progression and exploration, but it never intended to be a cinematic story. You create an original character, travel the world, and learn fighting styles, which is a perfectly valid approach for a game that doesn't have its own narrative universe to expand. Invincible Versus has the exact opposite, a rich universe, characters with complex backstories, and a plot full of layers that fans already know and love. Wasting that would be a crime. And from what's been presented, the developers seem to understand the weight of what they have in their hands. What excites me personally is the possibility of a story mode that answers questions the series hasn't yet, or that places characters in confrontations the comics never allowed. Imagine a narrative that justifies why Adam Eve is fighting Omni-Man, or that explores a conflict between villains the comics only touched on superficially. When the script is written by people who live that universe, these stories gain a credibility that no game studio could create alone, and the story mode stops being bonus content and becomes a real reason to buy, even for those who aren't hardcore fighting game fans. In the end, this deep narrative connection is the kind of thing that creates a legacy beyond the competitive scene. Street Fighter VI will be remembered for generations as one of the best fighting games ever made in terms of mechanics and combat systems. But Invincible Versus has the chance to be remembered also as a work that genuinely expanded the Invincible universe in a way that matters to those who follow the story. Very few fighting games have managed this, and most that did, like Injustice and Mortal Kombat in their best moments, are remembered to this day precisely because of their narratives and not just their gameplay. The recoverable health system linked to character swaps is one of those details that seems simple on paper, but profoundly changes how you fight every second of the match. The core idea is that when a character leaves the stage and goes into rest, they recover part of their lost health, meaning every swap decision carries double weight. You are both adjusting your offensive strategy and managing the survival of your entire team. This creates a constant tension that SF6, with its drive system, handles in a completely different and more concentrated way on a single character. What seems brilliant to me about this mechanic is that it punishes passivity without needing an aggressive timer. If you keep the same character on the field without swapping, you lose the recovery window and accumulate damage without any compensation. But if you swap too early, you might open gaps and waste the offensive momentum you were building. This dance of knowing exactly when to pull a character out and when to send them back in creates a micro game that I personally find more interesting than any drive or V-gauge mechanic I've seen in Street Fighter. Compared to SF6's drive system, which is very well made and rewards aggressiveness with resources, the Invincible Versus system seems more oriented toward resilience and long-term planning within the fight. In SF6, when you lose your drive, you suffer the consequences almost immediately, and the game punishes you directly. In Invincible Versus, the consequence of poor management is more cumulative and slower, which feels like a more strategic approach, almost like resource management you'd see in an RPG or strategy game, but within a frenetic fighting game. This system also has a direct impact on the emotional narrative of each match. There is something very satisfying about saving a near-dead character, letting them recover health in the reserves, and bringing them back at the right moment to close out a fight that seemed lost. This kind of comeback isn't possible in SF6 simply due to the nature of one-on-one. And when you multiply that by 3 characters with different styles, the number of stories that can unfold in a single match is much higher, making every fight feel unique and unpredictable until the final second.
Stay out of my way, old man.
Right on time.